Lofi Girl is a YouTube channel that offers several videos and live streams of relaxing study music, normally hip-hop beats or other forms of lo-fi music. And the thumbnail of the video itself is usually a variation of an animation of a girl, usually studying or relaxing with a cat on the window or lying somewhere close by. And because I stream their content a lot, the Lofi Girl character has somehow become lodged in my brain. So as an artist, of course, I can't resist the urge to make something out of it. So what you'll be watching today is my process of creating my version of Lofi Girl. I'll start this by painting the outlines of my character and all the other elements in the painting using oil paints that's been mixed with a lot of terpenoid, which is the solvent I'm going to be using in this painting. The lines you can see on the surface of the canvas are what are known as a grid, and there's a similar grid pasted on top of the reference image itself. So what I'm doing here is identifying the way the lines or the main contours in the image interact with the grid, then transferring that onto my canvas. The grid has been drawn in chalk because I want to get rid of it when I'm done with this outline stage. And the grey surface I'm painting on is an acrylic layer that itself has been painted on top of a white silk vinyl primer. I don't know if it's too early to recognize her, but the model posing as Lofi Girl in this painting is the same model I painted in my version of the Milkmaid, which I covered in a previous video. And this is just going to be one of the many projects in which I've worked with her. Her name is Gertrude, and I've linked her Instagram in the description should you want to check out more of her work. Back to the artwork though. Now that I'm done painting all these confusing lines, it's time to start creating the underpainting. Of course, I've gotten rid of the chalk outlines, and I did that by lightly passing a wet brush on the surface of the canvas. I'm creating the underpainting in acrylic, just like the grey background behind it. And the process I'll use for this is with a very simple palette of only 5 hues of the same color. In this case, the dark brown you can see. I'll cover different sections of the underpainting, starting by the darkest one, then gradually shifting from color to color till the entire surface is covered. I won't bother with creating perfect transitions here because this underpainting layer will be fully covered anyway when the painting is done. And for the same reason, I also won't obsess with many minor details. The goal in this stage will be to simply get the contrast right and have something that approximates what the final image will kind of look like. I also won't be mixing any of this paint with a solvent, and for acrylic the solvent is normally water. So in this stage the only place where water will come in handy will be to clean the brushes when I'm shifting from one color to the next. The choice of using acrylic in this stage is mostly inspired by its rapid drying time, which will enable me to move on to the next stage as soon as I'm done with the underpainting. Of course, there's a flip side here, or a disadvantage, in that it rushes me, so I'm not able to hone in on any small detail, but again, like I said, those are not very necessary in this stage. Oil paints are also an option for an underpainting stage, but unfortunately for that, even though they'll afford the artist enough time to tweak the different contrasts on canvas before the underpainting dries, when you're finished with the underpainting, you'll have to wait maybe a couple of days so that it's dry enough that you can now come in and paint your final layer. With acrylics, however, I can finish this stage and start oil painting immediately. Just like in Lofi Girl's animation, the scene here is such that Gertrude is sat on a studying table or an office table looking outside a window, except in this case there's another building right outside, so that's what I'm going to start by painting even in the underpainting. Then afterwards I'll paint the grills of the window, sort of cutting through that background. You may also have realized I'm now painting the background last, which is the opposite of what I normally do with oils. And this is because in the underpainting stage, I like to set my contrasts, so that is the level of darkness or lightness of different sections based on how these lights and darks interact in the main character. So in this case, Gertrude's shadows and highlights are what are going to inform how dark or how bright everything else around her is going to appear, including the plants, the table, the laptop, the window frames, and of course the scene outside. Also, because of how fast acrylic dries, you'll find that in the process of creating this underpainting, I may have had to mix the same color palette maybe twice or thrice within the space of say 4 or 5 hours. And so on come the window frames, and with all that done, we now have ourselves an underpainting. Since I want to start by painting the scene outside, I'm going to cover the window frames with sellotape. That will only be these dark sections. And if I take the camera around to the other side of the light, it's easier to see how just the grills are covered. The oil painting stage begins here, and with oils I'm going to start with the background, which is the opposite of how I did it in the previous stage. So what I'm painting here are the roofs of the buildings outside, and of course because of the tape that's covering the window frames, I'm able to very freely paint over them because I know that afterwards I can always remove the tape and I'll have a clean border that shows me just where the frames end and where the background begins. Without using the tape, I would have had to be very careful around the edges of the window frames, and so this particular step would have taken maybe twice as much time as it's going to take me now. I'll also mention that unlike the last time I used oils, which was in the outline stage, this time the paint isn't mixed with any solvent. So this is oil paints as it comes directly from the tube. And I'm not mixing it with any solvent here so that I can paint these cloudy transitions very seamlessly and very easily. And solvent would have made this very difficult. In most parts of my artworks, I also like to paint white after every other color because this allows me to make all the other colors relatively dark, given that there's no white on the canvas at this stage when I'm painting them, so that when I finally apply the white color, the contrast is heightened. And so with the building outside finished, I'm now going to move on and paint the wall inside. I've added more sellotape to kind of mask the sections that are going to be bordering straight lines, like the edges of the table or the laptop or the windowsill. But for the areas that have more organic shapes, like when I'm painting around the flask or around the individual leaves of the houseplants, I don't need to mask those sections. I have a bit more leeway in terms of how faithfully or how accurately I can mirror what I'm seeing on my screen. And like I did with the building outside, the process of creating these smooth transitions begins by laying in the different colors almost in a similar way to how I was painting the underpainting before, except since oil paints take a long time to dry. After doing that, I can then take a dry brush and smoothen all the different borders or all the transitions between these different colors. And so we end up with the transitions that look very smoky or very cloudy. When all that is done, I can finally peel off the tape and you can see just how well it preserved the borders of where the frames were supposed to be. I'm not done with sellotape though, because now I'll be doing the exact opposite of what I did earlier. So in this case, I'll be blocking out the sections of the background and middle ground that border these window frames, then painting the window frames themselves in between. This is a much simpler process now because at least with the window frames, I don't have to blend in any colors or create any transitions. It's just one dark color all through, and the dark color I'm using is burnt umber. But you can imagine how difficult it would have been to try and create these straight lines freehand. So sellotape really helps in this case. Masking tape could have done a similar job, except for this painting I wanted to see what was in the background. And sellotape, being transparent, is the only kind of tape that can afford me that privilege. In any case, off it goes, and next up I'll now fill up all the sections which I couldn't paint over since the tape was passing through them. So right now it looks like a window that doesn't have any glasses. So to make these windows look like actual glasses, I'm gonna have to paint now the dirt or the condensation or the different blemishes and imperfections that appear on glass. So I'm gonna start by painting them first on the section where the neighbor's roof is visible, because since I used a darker color for that section, it's already dried. But I'll spare the yellow wall close to Gertrude's face for the latter part of the painting, because the yellow, at least for this brand of paint that I used, take a long time to dry. In the process, I realized most of the background wasn't dry yet, so I'm gonna have to move on to the books on the windowsill, then I'll come back and paint these windows themselves later. And so again, for the books, since they are, books and they have straight spines, I'm gonna have to use a lot of sellotape once again. And since I'm right-handed, I'll be painting them from left to right in a kind of repetitive process that involves covering the border of one book, at least on the right side, painting that book, removing the tape, then doing the same for the next book and the next book and the next one, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times. Then I'll move on to the next step. And what is the next step, you ask? That will be painting the shadows and the reflections of those books on the windowsill. The windowsill itself will also be a simple affair, so with the aid of my favorite companion in this painting, the sellotape, I will cover the now dry wall, paint the windowsill, get rid of the tape, then do the same for the table and the laptop afterwards. A lot of planning and thinking ahead is necessary when painting something using this process, because it's important to figure out what you want to start with and how the different sections and the different colors you use on them will dry relative to the colors of the item close by. So in this case, I'm painting, say, the plants that are behind the laptop, but I have to start with those ones first, let them dry. Then I'll come back and do the same thing with the sellotape, but now the other way around, in that I'll cover the plants, then now paint the laptop itself. But if the plants are going to be painted in colors that will take a long time to dry, then it's actually better to start with the laptop first, then finish up with those plants, even though they're behind the laptop. And so my jumping around from item to item can look disjointed in this painting, but this is because, thanks to the extensive use of sellotape in this case, the decision isn't just based on what's behind what else, like I do in most of my paintings, which is normally, the background comes first, then the middle ground, then the foreground. In this case, I also have to think about the different drying rates or drying times of different colors. For the flask in front, for instance, you'll notice I'm using the tape for the straight edges, but then when it comes to the rounded top, I'm doing all that freehand. And you can see that by now, even though the laptop is behind the flask, I'm painting the laptop afterwards, because while I was painting the horizontal section of the laptop and that flask, the plant, or rather the painting of the plant behind the laptop, was drying. So now I'm able to confidently place sellotape on top of it without worrying about the tape damaging some of the paint. And so with most of the straight lines exhausted, we can now move on to the organic shapes and forms. So the first one is going to be the leaves of the houseplant. In some of these leaves, I'll start with the local color, which is green, to paint the lamina or the inside section of the leaf. And in others, I'll also start with the shadows, depending on which color is more prominent with the way we shot the image. But generally, the brighter midribs and veins are going to come in last, because going with the kind of running theme of how I paint colors, I tend to spare the brightest colors for last. The houseplant in the middle is multicolored, and graciously Bill made it blurred. By the way, Bill is the photographer who we shot it with. His handle is also available in the description. And because he made it blurred, I don't have to focus on painting each leaf with too much detail, as I did with the bigger plant on the left. And so after laying in all these colors, all I have to do is simply use a dry brush to blur the borders so that the entire plant looks like it's actually blurred. There won't be any headaches with the pots holding the plants because they're mostly dark. And then I'll move on to the cushions that are on the other side of Gertrude, so in this case, on the right side of the painting. This cushion is going to have some patterns on top of this green background color, but because I need the background color to fully dry before I can paint those, I'll first move on to something else, then I'll come back and finish those patterns later. And that something else in this case will be the office lamp, which is very unnecessarily turned on during the day, I know, but some of these choices are more aesthetic than practical. The lamp isn't actually a lot of work because most of it is basically colors next to each other that are kind of blurred, and so it will only take a few minutes to paint this, after which it will be time to finally paint Gertrude. The portrait itself will start with kind of revised outlines. So in this case, I'm painting exactly the outlines that I used in the very first stage, but now I'm painting them on top of the underpainting just to correct all the areas that I may have missed or that I may have painted over accidentally. And these are the lines that I'll now follow in my final oil layer. The glasses come first because, at least from our vantage point, they are behind her face and the rest of her head, after which I'll paint her face in very much the same way I did the underpainting, in that I'll start with the darkest colors, which is burnt umber and a derivative of burnt umber, or a mixture of burnt umber, burnt sienna, and a bit of orange. Then I'll move from color to color. In this case, I've skipped from the two darkest shadows to the two brightest highlights, and afterwards I'll cover all the remaining sections with a mid-tone or a local color, then blend them all in to create something that approximates a raster painting or a more realistic kind of face. The colors I'm using are also almost excessively vibrant, and that's because, at least in my later paintings, I like to heighten the warmth of different colors, especially when it comes to skin tones. And so after painting all those colors, first with big, then with medium brushes, then blending them together, I can then move in with smaller brushes and now paint the little bumps or pimples that characterize natural skin. And I paint this in very subtle fashion, starting first with their shadows, then the highlights. So they kind of stand out from the local color or the otherwise smooth skin, but you can only see them if you look at the painting in very close proximity. There's one more straight line to paint here, but I won't be using any tape because the paint that I've used for the face is still very much wet. And so a ruler will do a very limited amount of damage compared to what a tape would do. The face is pretty much done now, so now I'm going to move on to the headphones, then finally her hair. Given how bright her face looks like, at least the front part, you can tell that the light is coming from directly where she's looking at, and therefore her hair won't have any details visible because it will be in complete shadow. So after painting it in burnt umber, all I'll have to do is paint some reflections on the headband, then it will be time to paint the scarf. Again, the logic behind starting with the scarf here is simply that it's behind her hand and the mug. And by behind, I'm talking about from our vantage point. And so it will be easier to paint the hands and the mugs afterwards when that scarf is dry, so that we don't have to be very careful around the margins or the edges where the two sections touch, namely the hand and the scarf in this case. I'll paint the hands in exactly the same way as I did the face before it, because I'm using the same colors. And the reason why I haven't started with the cap, even though it's behind her left hand, is because since I want to paint this section in one sitting, I don't have the time to wait for the cap to dry so that I can paint the hand on top of it, which is what I've done with all the other sections. And if I were to start painting the hand when the cap behind it hasn't dried yet, then the edges of where these two parts of the painting touch, namely the hand and the cap, will sort of blend into each other, and so the colors of the hand will be impurified by those of the cup. So as you can see, in different parts of the painting, I make different decisions based on how those particular sections behave and also how much time I have and how I want to paint them. And so these are not just blanket decisions that cover every section. So the reasoning that I'm using in this section, for instance, may not apply in the next one and vice versa. And this kind of versatility or adjustability helps, especially when you have deadlines or when you're faced with challenging paintings that have so much going on like this one. So a good understanding of the way paint behaves and the way it dries and how it blends together and so on and so forth is vital for artworks of this sort. Another reason why it was easy to paint the cup afterwards in this case is because there's barely any detail in the cup. So all I have to do is paint in the burnt umber in between her fingers. However, if the cup had a bit more detail to it, then the calculations may have been different. So in that case, I may have had to move on to a different section of the painting, then come back and paint the hand later. And now that I've spent all this time painting all these other parts of the painting, the cushion behind Gertrude is now fully dry, and so I can now go back to it and finally paint on the background color the patterns on top of it. Because of where the light is coming from, most of Gertrude's sweater will be completely dark, so this will be an easier part of the painting than most. And it will be followed by a bit of some visible details on the cushion that's now closest to us. By this time, the background that I started with is now completely dry, so I can come back with my very unfortunate soft brushes and paint the condensation on the window by repeatedly hitting the canvas the way a woodpecker hits a tree trunk. This is the only way I can cover these sections as fast as I want to, and also make the spots of dirt and condensation random enough, because if I take too much time painting them one by one, chances are they'll end up looking too symmetrical to be believable. So a few brushes died in the creation of this painting, but hopefully the result will be worth it. I'm gonna finish this painting with my favorite part, which is the reflection that the filament of the bulb casts on the window. And this is my favorite part because even though the filament looks white to us because of how bright it's burning, its reflection is yellow because the colors are so muted given that it's daytime, which is an effect I wouldn't have come up with or even guessed if I was doing this offhand. So it's always interesting to observe and learn these things through photography as well. Anyway, the painting is finished, and I'll actually use this as a chance to give a shout out to Bill or Kenyan Library, who's the photographer I work with for some of these projects. The way I use contrast in my paintings, at least lately, is not very different from how he takes his photographs. So feel free to take a look at some of his work as you check out more of Gertrude's modeling as well. And once again, the links to both of their pages are in the description. So thanks a lot for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope to see you in the next one.